So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Giovanni Scioni, and well, I had the easy task to present Peter Rosenbaum to the audience. I said an easy task because everybody knows Peter. Myself, I know Peter since many years. Peter, for the few who do not know Peter, Peter has been professor at Pediatric at McMaster University, co-founder of the famous Can Child Center for Childhood Disability, recipient of many awards, including the Cerebral Palsy Foundation Prize at one of the last EACD meeting, because Peter has been a lecturer at many of our EACD meetings, and I can testify that every time he has been able to enrich our thoughts and given to us new ideas. Well, I did not agree all times with some of them, but I felt all time very enriched. So I'm sure I will also do the case this time. And the title of Peter's lecture is going to be Feeding Back to Feed Forward. How to we use lessons from adults' experience to impact children and families. Peter, thanks.
Thank you, Giovanni, for the kind comments. I have many more slides than I usually do and a lot more text than I usually do, and I'll explain as I go along. I believe, first of all, that the session is being recorded, so it will be available later on. And I'm also happy to make a PDF file with the slides so that people can have more detail or have access to the detail. So I see us going on a journey, and I want to try to make a case that includes the usual stuff. My wife says I only have one talk, but I'm going to try to change it a little bit today. And some of you will recognize some of these ideas, but I think the main point that I was asked to consider was to think about looking back where we've come from in order to feed forward, in order to look at what lessons we can learn. And I think there is an enormous resource of experience and information that can be available to us from the experiences of adults who used to be children with developmental conditions. And I think we can use those lessons to impact the work we're doing with current families. And so I'm asking you to consider these ideas. I propose a series of interconnected thoughts. First of all, to think about the culture of disability, because where we've come from clearly influences where we're going. To think about who we are, and I will say a little bit more about this because there are many we people to consider. Where are we now and where should we be going? That's clearly the key idea. And how can we change and expand our service systems? That is the challenge, because even when we agree with an idea, if we don't know how to do it, it becomes really possibly threatening. I want to talk about why change is essential, and then to think about a little bit about how we can know whether we're succeeding. So the first thing to state is the obvious, that the people who work in our field, in the European Academy of Childhood Disability, the American Academy of Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine, and so on, we start our work with children and families when the children are young. So it's important to state some of the obvious realities. Childhood developmental disability is mainly focused on health. We are mostly, not entirely, but mostly health professionals, doctors, therapists, social workers, psychologists, and so on, who work in health systems. We're trained and experienced to work with children, sometimes with youth, much less often with people across the age range. The conditions that we work with, cerebral palsy, autism, and so on, all present in children's early lives. And that's partly why childhood disability is talked about in that way. Adults don't suddenly present with these conditions. Most of our services are constrained and limited by a variety of factors that cause them to stop at age 18, maybe age 21, as I heard the other day from a colleague. And in that sense, the children and youth disappear from our services. They can no longer be admitted to our children's clinics and hospitals and so on. And parents and young adults talk about falling off the cliff. And a parent of a colleague of mine told me recently, you were flying without a parachute, and all we could hope for was that you help you land softly. My friend and colleague Jan Willem Gorter shared this slide with me recently, and the comment is, in the medical community, they call it transition, which is our nice way of saying things. Parents call it falling off the cliff. And this visual, I think, dramatically illustrates how people experience this. And this is an international idea. This is not just from one country. Some of the implications of these realities are that childhood disability is about children and youth, and that's not a problem, but it is a limitation. We lose formal connection with young people and the issues in their lives when they outgrow our services, as I mentioned a minute ago. And I say we lose formal connection because I suspect that everybody listening to this conversation has occasional, if not frequent, contacts from former children, families of former children calling us because they are uncertain where to get access to services, not just medical and therapy services, but lots of other issues, because the adult community isn't yet ready for them. And so when we want to stay connected, it's difficult. We can't see them in clinic, and we can't admit them to hospital if they need that, and so on. And you'll see at the bottom of a number of slides, I have something in purple. And this is just to remind me to say that the key message in these slides is in purple. So in this case, I'm saying that we usually lack the experience of the adult needs and services. We also, as health professionals, tend to see the adult needs in terms of health issues, when in fact, there's a vast array of other issues about social relationships, employment, housing, recreation, and so on, that go well beyond the focus that we have as health professionals. How did we get here? Well, many of you heard this message before. Our tradition has been biomedical thinking. And I want to emphasize, as I always do, that this is not a criticism of that approach. It is simply to say that this approach, first of all, has acculturated us to think in certain ways and is limited relative to how we're thinking these days. So the focus was on making the right diagnosis, finding and applying the right treatments, aiming to fix problems, and obviously expecting that improved function, when the problem was treated, would lead to improved ability for people to live their lives. And there's lots of evidence that this is a naive, it's a useful hope, but a naive one. And in fact, rarely do our treatments in themselves lead to big changes in people's lives. The second reality is age categories, and I've already referred to this. I gave a talk some months ago to the medical students and asked them basically, why do we need pediatrics? And tried to encourage them to think about the distinction between adults and children. And there are obviously many, and I won't belabor the point, but when children grow up and become adults and they leave childhood, they leave many of the services behind that have helped them and their families. And so the fact that services are specialized by age with little cross connection to the adult world is another challenge that they and we face. In the 20th century, disability was a within the person issue. We saw problems. We talk about severity. We talk about what people can't do. We focused much less on family, much less on environment. We tended to assess children and look at best capacity, which we could see in clinic. And then when we heard about or observed lower performance, we were disappointed. We made assumptions about child's lack of motivation, families' lack of engagement in therapy, in part because we weren't thinking about what else is going on in their lives, including what's going on in their environments. And so we didn't look past childhood, and we had a very narrow view of the issues. The biomedical understanding focuses on disorders, and as I said, focuses on what's wrong, efforts to treat and fix. We've measured and evaluated change at the level of body structure and function, and we know that often there can be important changes in body structure and function that are not associated with improvements in quality of life or functioning. And we've been disappointed at our apparent limitations and failures. And again, I want to emphasize the limited view we have of people's lives because we only see part of the story. We only read part of the novel in the first 2 decades of life. One of the implications of these ideas is that we haven't seen the family as the focus of our work. We haven't thought about a life course approach. And again, I know many people recognize this theme and probably are disappointed that we haven't been able to do this, but aren't sure how to do it. We also have not paid enough attention to the social determinants of health. And sadly, the COVID pandemic has brought out for everybody's attention how social determinants of health are phenomenally important in terms of mortality, morbidity, and so on. The other comment I make here is that society tends not to pay much attention to children. And I once heard an important person, I don't remember who it was, but I was absolutely staggered by the idea that children and youth were referred to as a special interest group. So I mention this only to say that these are some of the things we're up against, we who are child and family advocates. And we really must, and the field must, and the world must widen our scope of thinking. So I mentioned that I thought we should be paying attention to the people who are concerned, who are impacted by this. And obviously children and families, children and young people, their families, ourselves as service providers. But it goes bigger than that, as Bronfenbrenner's model so beautifully showed many years ago. The systems and services with which these kids and families are involved, the community. What do community people know about adults with impairments, and are they prepared to accommodate them in the workplace and in recreational facilities and so on? And then eventually policymakers. And I like to say that policymakers are smart, dedicated, hardworking people. They don't usually come to conferences like ours, and they don't hear these ideas. And we have an opportunity and an obligation to share the best of this kind of thinking, and obviously all of what's coming out of the EACD meeting, with them. So what are we looking for if we're going to look forward? First of all, where are we going? There are enormous changes in our field, and I think much for the better in terms of 21st century thinking. We're being influenced by a number of contemporary themes, some of them from our own field and some of them from other things that are going on in the world around us. And I want to look at these briefly to ask, first of all, who needs to know them, and second of all, to think about what they mean for what we do and what we could be doing going forward. And not surprisingly, the World Health Organization's ICF framework and the F words fit into this story. I really like this idea that health is the ability to adapt and self-manage in the face of social, physical, and emotional challenges. And this is a slide and a quote that we use every time we talk about these ideas. So functioning, regardless of whether it's done nicely, is evidence of health. Both Giovanni and I don't have perfect vision. How do I know? Because we both wear glasses. But if with our glasses we can do what we need to do, then we are functioning, and that's what's important. Thinking about developmental disability, we have tended traditionally to think in categories. You work with children with cerebral palsy, I work with people with autism, somebody else works with people with head injury, and so on. And there is an importance to those categories, but there is also a lot of evidence that across these categories, there are many, many issues that are common in terms of the impact on the children, on the family, on the community, on the educational system, and so on. And if we put some of our efforts together to think non-categorically, thinking beyond diagnoses, we can probably have a bigger impact. We're also learning that children with cerebral palsy, autism, and so on grow up and become adults with those conditions. And it is essential, whether it is we ourselves or other people, it is essential that we take a life course approach to these lifelong child onset conditions, which are not just childhood conditions. So everybody, I suspect, knows this and can draw this in their sleep, the ICF framework. And among the things that we like about it is that it focuses on can versus cannot. And when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking that we could spend an hour just discussing this picture. Because the people who are worried about posture and so on might be upset that this child's seating isn't as good as it could be, that he clearly has a number of impairments. The optimists would say that this child is going to school. This is his first day of junior kindergarten. He clearly has a lot of services in place, whether you like the seating or not. He has a powered mobility device, and he is extremely happy. And I think we need to spend more time promoting with children and families, promoting development, child and family strengths, achievement. We need to be family-centered, and we need to bring in life course thinking. And I'm going to elaborate on that in a minute. I think most of you are familiar with the F words in child development. This is the Polish version. For those who don't speak Polish, if you need it, let me know. We also have about 30 other translations of it. And we now refer to these as my favorite words. They don't have to be F words, and clearly, as you see in Polish, they don't all start with F. In fact, one of them does. But these concepts have had a huge uptake by parents and families, and increasingly by colleagues around the world. And we have a poster which now integrates the ICF framework in the smaller boxes inside and the F words in the larger boxes. We also are encouraging people not only to translate the words, but to translate the graphics so that in your community, wherever you are, the pictures may reflect more effectively what is appropriate for kids and families. The other thing that we added to the ICF framework that isn't part of it is future. And for the obvious reason that children are in a process of becoming belonging, they're in the process of developing, a process of acquiring the skills in life that they will need. And future reminds us that the kids are a work in progress, and so are their families. And for a lot of people, this is a new idea. It does not in any way take away from therapy or interventions or equipment or anything else, but it provides a different context than we have usually thought about. So how can we expand and change things? We need to change our thinking, or at least expand our thinking, to see childhood onset disability in the perspective of a life course. We need to consider new frameworks, and I'm going to show you a few in a minute. We need to learn the lessons from the people who know, the people who have it, and to understand their lives and our potential roles in their lives in a unique way. And I should say at this point that this talk has been looked at by two of my young colleagues whose work I'm going to refer to in a minute, both of whom have child and youth onset conditions, and their voices are strongly reflected in this talk, although I take the responsibility for the dumb things that are said. So some obvious realities, lots of things, lots and lots of things influence everybody's life. And impairment, the part that we know, is only a small part, or is a part, and sometimes a small part, of people's lives. Impairment does not cause disability. This is a World Health Organization concept. Impairment does not cause disability. Disability is a social issue. And if social values and behaviors and practices, not just environmental changes, can change, then people with impairments will have a much better opportunity to become part of society and then be not disabled, even though they have impairments. We know the kids because of special knowledge and skills that we have in impairments. And we might easily assume that anything that's going on with them is related to their impairment. But if we take a bigger view of child and family and community, we may see that many of the things that are challenging for these kids and families are outside of the child and maybe can be addressed and remedied more effectively than we've traditionally done when we've thought only about the biomedical issues. Neil Halfon is a pediatrician in California who has been talking about these ideas, not specifically in disability, for a long time, and has articulated a life course health development framework, which I want to show you briefly. This is in some ways, for many people, a statement of the obvious, that the trajectories of people's lives in blue may be great, in yellow may be not so great, and in red may be very poor. There is an enormous number of factors that influence this, and this is just in the preschool years. So poverty isn't good for you. Toxic stress isn't good for you. Preschools are helpful. Health services can be helpful. Parents' well-being can be enormously helpful, and so on. And this is before the disability issues are even thought about. And so again, in this larger spectrum and perspective on child health, we need to recognize that in addition to impairment or impairment, many other things can be going on. The other thing that they show in their paper, it's a long and rather dense paper, but worth the effort. Trajectories are not straight, linear, or overly determined, but can be in a constant state of flux relative to different influences at different points in time. And so here we see, for example, high social status, positive parenting are obviously important. Low social status in itself is epidemiologically a risk factor. Positive school environments can be very helpful. Access to care can be very helpful. Job insecurity is a threat. And if we think about these ideas, which are for everybody, which apply to everybody, then we can see how there may be things outside of the disability, outside of the impairment, that can be incredibly important, and in which we as a group, we as a community can have a big impact. So I want to show you 3 examples of work that bring these ideas together. The first is some excellent work that Bob Palisano, who many of you know, led through CanChild. And the reason his name is in green is to remind me to tell you that one of the important contributors to this work was Dr. Matt Freeman. Matt was an ex-prem baby and a patient I used to see. He has level 4 cerebral palsy and a PhD in rehabilitation science. And this study with which Matt was closely involved was designed to understand how young people with cerebral palsy, young adults with cerebral palsy, experience life course health and development. What were their words? What were their ideas? And to extract some key messages for pediatric health service providers. The method involves a qualitative approach to research called interpretive description, a purposive sample of 23 young adults with CP, 25 to 33 years of age. They varied in their functional abilities, their education, their living arrangements, their work situations. They participated in individual hour-long interviews, and a number of themes were identified. And then there was a one-day advisory group meeting with a group of people that Bob and Matt had pulled together to reflect on these and see what messages we could extract. And 4 themes emerged from what the young people said. These were not our ideas, these were their ideas. They talked about a personal life course, along the ways that Halfon does. They talked about context for healthy living, the things that contribute, the things that might make healthy living more difficult. They talked about health development through everyday experiences, and I can't emphasize that enough. They talked about healthy living as an adaptive process. And there are clearly messages that come out of these themes for us as service providers. We need to address healthy living across the life course, starting from childhood, sharing these ideas with families. We need to focus on context for healthy living and not just assume that that people will be ready to fit in anywhere. We need to focus on everyday experiences and what everybody learns from those experiences, including people with impairments and including the rest of us. And then we need to pay attention to the timing of the opportunities and experiences. So when there are opportunities, we need to help families and young people seize those opportunities. And their conclusion was that the adoption of an approach to life course health development for individuals with CP should emphasize physical and mental and emotional well-being and goals for desired social participation. And we need to start these ideas early. We need to talk to families, not about what their young people won't be able to do, because that is actually quite destructive and can, in fact, be right for the wrong reasons, but focus on development toward a fulfilling future as an adult, even if you need glasses, even if you use a wheelchair, even if. The second study was one that was written up by Julia Haynes, who, when she was a teenager, had a pretty serious injury that left her with a left hemi syndrome. She's now a final year medical student. And if you need sutures, she'll suture you with one hand. And if you happen to need intubation, she can do that with one hand. And she is simply somebody who has learned to adapt. And the qualitative study that she was involved with concluded that body structure and function, you'll notice I've emphasized the ICF words, body structure and function impairments impact participation in activities of daily living, which threaten participants' ability to form positive identities and live meaningful lives. People with CP desire to work, but may require additional training, accommodation, and support, just as all of us who are professionals required additional training to do what we do. Environmental conditions, including relationships, supportive people, and accessibility, all shape participants' health, well-being, and social and civic engagement. And the reference is here to childcare, health, and development. And this study confirms the need for improved care for adults with CP, including multidisciplinary adult health services and community services. And again, this goes beyond what we have to offer. It includes what we have to offer, some of which may be advocacy as opposed to technical interventions. The third piece of work is, in some ways, the most revealing because it's the most personal. Dr. Susan Gunther is a friend of mine now in her early 40s. She was a PhD student with me for some years and taught me at least as much as I might ever have taught her. She's an occupational therapist with spina bifida. She trained and worked as a clinical OT, then was a research OT, then did her studies in rehab science, taking a critical disability studies lens to her work. She did something called an autoethnographic thesis. That is to say, basically a reflection on her life, which she was able to do because she had started keeping a journal in real time from the age of about 10. And she had access to this remarkable set of observations, which she journaled for at least 25 years. And what she did was to consider her life issues as a professional, as a person with an impairment, and to reflect, among other things, on how we treated her. And I believe that when this is ready as a book, it should be required reading for everybody in our field because it provides insights that are just so compelling. I just put up here the titles of the chapters to show the evolution of the self-image. And as I say, this was over 25 or 30 years. I walk, therefore I am. I walk, therefore I am between two worlds. I am independent, which is celebrated. I am oppressed, her feeling about how people were treating her. I am deemed to be compliant. I am abled. I am less disabled. And finally, as she comes to accommodate who she is and how she is, her last chapter is, I walk, therefore I simply am. Now, Susan can walk. She mostly uses a wheelchair. And this piece of work has been written up in a briefer form in this paper. And as I say, when this book comes out, I think it will be a very, very powerful piece of material for people to read, to really get inside the experience of an intelligent young person who from the age of 10 is journaling her observations. She's not angry at people, but she is able to reflect on the various stages of her life experience. So I asked at the beginning, why is change essential? And I've already answered some of this. We only know part of the story of the children and youth and families with whom we work, and we only know part of the story of children with impairments. They have a huge amount to tell us and teach us, as I've tried to illustrate briefly with these examples. We have a lot to understand from them and to feed back to the next children and families we see. And that to me is the key issue, feeding back, learning from what's gone on to feed back to try to influence the future. And I think there is so much more that we can be doing. We may disagree about how to do it, but I hope there's no argument that this is an important part of where we have to go. How do we do this? We clearly need buy-in from everybody. That seems a tall order. The people who have the biggest opportunity are the people listening to this conversation today, the people who find these ideas compelling and can start to use them with kids and families and with each other. We need managers who will be creative in their ways of thinking about how we run our programs. We need programs that can be imaginative and be bold and be ready to try things outside the box, or quite frankly, get rid of the box. We need communities that will take the courage to accept everyone, and that includes, for example, potential employers who are prepared to consider providing opportunities for employment, paid employment. I don't mean token employment. That's just one of many examples. And then we need policymakers whom we have to inform to recognize that there are opportunities to expand thinking about the policies. And I believe that all of these are changes within our power, because they are not issues that relate to the well-being of the community. This is not a high-income, low-income issue. This is an issue of ideas and attitudes. Ways we might think about doing this, and again, based on a conversation I've had with a young colleague recently, can we embed child health professionals in adult programs so that they are there to participate in the transition from child to adult? The colleague in question is a GI specialist who works in a transition program. She works as a translator of some of the issues from childhood to her adult colleagues. And I think that by doing that, we can support adult colleagues to become more comfortable, to do a better job than is often done to support young people and their families. I think we can improve accessibility to every aspect of life and not just to the biomedical. And clearly, if you like these ideas, we have to become knowledge brokers, people who not only understand these ideas, but are prepared to share them and to promote them so that others who don't know these ideas yet become interested in them. They are all positive opportunities, and they don't challenge what people are doing, they challenge what people are not doing. Finally, how will we know if we succeed? We can ask the question, are the lives of young people today richer and more fulfilled than young people in the past? How do we know that? We ask them. And everybody in this conversation will know that there is an increasing expectation that we listen to the voices of the people who have it, what are called PROs, patient-reported outcomes, whether these are done with measures or whether these are done in interviews. We can ask about independence and interdependence. Do people feel comfortable to ask for help? A point that Susan Gunther pointed out to me. It's not just about independence. It's about feeling comfortable to know when you need help. We can ask about skills at advocacy. Do they feel they are able to express their needs and articulate their needs and argue for their needs more effectively now? Are employment and personal relationship issues improving with young people growing up in the current era, and certainly things to look for in the future? And self-reported quality of life, not just whether you walk okay. And we can do constant quality assurance in our programs to find out whether these things are happening. They don't have to be done as formal research projects. So I asked a number of questions. What has our culture of disability been? Who are we? Where are we going? How can we change and expand our service systems? Why is change essential? And how will we know if we succeed? This has been a rather fast run through what could be a half-day workshop. I appreciate the opportunity to reflect on these ideas. I've had a lot of fun pulling these ideas together. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope we'll have some time for discussion. And you'll notice Giovanni staring at you here. He doesn't have his glasses on, but he wants to challenge, as I hope all of you will. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter. Well, maybe your wife is saying that you're always giving the same lecture, but I have to, as anticipated, you can put in your lecture always new ideas, and I feel very enriched for many challenges, many material to think about. Well, I will have a couple of questions, but good enough that we are already receiving questions. We have about 5 minutes, 6 minutes for questions. So the first is coming from Veronica Schioriti. And she said, since the ICF was published in 2001, how can we work together to adopt the international framework across the lifespan now?
Well, that's a question I would expect Veronica to actually be able to answer. I think that the easy things to do are to bring the concepts of the ICF framework into all our discussions, our case reports and so on, any presentations we do, any conversations we have with policymakers. It is incredibly frustrating to me that, to my knowledge, no medical school in Canada teaches the ICF. The people who know about it in our medical school are the medical students who've been exposed to the F-Words paper by some of my colleagues, not by me. But we need to bring this framework, a World Health Organization framework, to everybody's attention, so that at least people are asking questions about the language, are seeing the connections that exist among the components.
Good. There are already a couple more questions. The following question was, what is your take on starting to educate at school the young children about disability and your respect of each other? So education to disability, to the so-called normal, typical children toward that.
Well, the expression in English is there's nothing new under the sun. We did some work many, many years ago, and it was built on other people's work about attitudes toward childhood disability. And even before we structure things, it turns out that familiarity with somebody with an impairment is associated with better attitudes. That means that if we have appropriately developed integration in schools, we will have regular, typically developing children being exposed to children with impairments. You can then structure various kinds of activities, non-competitive activities, to enable young people to become familiar with people who do things differently, who use a wheelchair, who are blind, or whatever. With the recognizing the investment that these young people at some point will be adults in the community, who might be employers, who might be colleagues of a person with a disability. So there is a lot that can be done that is not complicated.
Well, I think I take advantage of being the moderator just to add a few words to your reply. You know, as an Italian, and as a bit of provocative as well, I think the best answer to that is full inclusion at school. And school is the environment for the children. So we should really, in an international perspective, push more and more this reply to these questions to the full integration. Well, there is another, now we have an easy question, Peter. That might be generating, well, what can be better generating a better society, better group of future leaders and policy makers? And an easy answer, Peter.
Well, we need more people with visible differences in positions of responsibility. We've had that in Canada when our Prime Minister was first elected. Half his cabinet was women. We had people who wore turbans. We had we had at least one person in a wheelchair. This is not tokenism. There are a lot of good people around, but if we also will look for people who can bring these additional elements of who they are and what society looks like, we will do a better job than we're doing now. My friend Julia Haynes, the young woman who's a medical student, has done a lot of reading about how many people with visible disabilities are in the medical field, and it is a very, very small proportion. And, you know, if you have the opportunity as a person with an impairment to be treated by somebody else with an impairment, that is a stunning experience. So there's lots we could be doing.
Sure. Well, I don't see other questions. That time is expiring. Let me just say one point and ask your opinion about. Don't you think it's a time to build up, based on the very important thing you said, to try to build up a group to make a strong recommendation around that, to be proposed to International Alliance, American Academy, and European Academy? I mean, because I think they're so rich and so important, your point. We should translate into an open panel of discussion into recommendation for all the rounds. Do you agree?
Well, of course I agree. The International Alliance is still the International Alliance of Academies of Childhood Disability, and you and I are both active in that, and that's not a criticism. But what about offering to make presentations like these, like the presentations at this year's EACD, to adult audiences in adult rehabilitation, in adult physical medicine, and so on? Maybe we need to bring these ideas to their attention, not because they're bad people, but because nobody talks about these things in their settings. So there may be many opportunities for us to bring these ideas forward.
Sure. I think the training of scientists or professionals working with children and the training of adults working with disability should be much more mixed.
Absolutely.
I think that is very crucial.
Age distinction is arbitrary.
Absolutely. I think there is another question. Maybe you can have it for further replies. I mean, more questions are coming, but I think our time expired. And
I know that your time is different than mine. I'm available if people want to stay. If we're able to stay for a few minutes, I can continue the discussion. But I don't want to take up the
that is really, Peter. I mean, you can spend life in discussion. You're quite Italian in this respect, Peter, I must say.
And I use my hands.
Yeah, sure, you should. You should. Well, let me just give one more question concerning the F words. The
Yes.
suggestion is some works on adult-focused F words.
Well, thank you for that comment, whoever made it. In fact, we've been asked that for the last few years, and we do have a poster like the one I showed with adult graphics. There is absolutely no reason why the F words don't apply to adults, and in fact, there are people using them in the adult world. These are, the F words started off being F words for childhood disability because that's where Jan Willem and I work. Then people said, well, wait a minute, these are F words for child development. And of course, they're now, if you think about the International Classification of Functioning on which the F words are based, it is a framework for health for everybody. And so absolutely agree that these words are every bit as relevant to adult, to the lives of adults and their families.
Thank you very much. I think we have to leave to the people the opportunity to do also a break and virtual exhibition too. But really, thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you, kind sir.
Lecture, and I hope to see you soon in vivo. At another, you know, American, European, whatever.
Anywhere besides my TV room. Now, thank you
very much, Peter.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.